My name is Borat. This is my country of Kazakhstan. Greatest country in the world.
It's an interesting experience when you know nothing about Laurel and Hardy, thanks to Stalin.
Oh, can I give you a shine?
No thanks.
But once you get to see them, it's like you've known them your whole life. Their play and their chemistry, it all feels instantly familiar, where innocence and kindness are never lost. They don't just make you laugh, they make you feel at home, as though they are part of your own memories. That feeling is no accident. In the 1930s, Laurel and Hardy won an Oscar for Best Short Films for The Music Box, and they were popular in America and around the world for their comedies like Son of the Desert and Way Out West. But before that, in mid-1920s, Laurel and Hardy were also very successful, establishing themselves as a comedy duo during the silent film era. In those earlier years, they developed a style of comedy that was simple in setup, but full of character and humanity. Laurel often played an innocent, almost childlike figure whose clumsy attempts at solving problems that only made things worse.
Here's another nice mess I got you into.
Hardy, by contrast, carried himself with gentle dignity, reacting with exasperated looks, sighs, and slow-burning frustration as the house unfolded around him. What set them was not only physical gags and slapstick, but also with the rhythm of their partnership, the perfectly timed pauses, a believable story, and especially those moments when Hardy looked at us in shyness and despair, making us his confidence. They are closer to real people than other great comedians, vulnerable, flawed, and they are genuinely kind. Their comedy was never cruel. In even their most disastrous misadventures, they remained warm and gentle souls. Stan and Laurel spent a surprising amount of time trying to discover just what kind of comedian he wanted to be and how to shape a personality of his own. Throughout his solo career, he was performer, still searching for a clear identity. In the dozens of films he made on his own, he shifted between playing the bold, overconfident type and the slow, simple fellow, often mixing the two in the same story. One that never quite settled into lasting or memorable screen personality. Oliver Hardy had already built up years of experience in films, although he was far from a star. He began acting in the 1910s, appearing in the dozens of short comedies, usually in supporting roles. With his large frame and surprising grace for his size, Hardy often played the heavy or comic villain, the man who got in the hero's way. Yet even these earlier parts he showed gentleness that made him different from the typical bad guy. Past Laurel and Hardy proceeded thanks to Jess Robbins, a director who had known G.M. Anderson from old SNA days. Anderson, better remembered as Bronco Billy, was one of the first great cowboy stars. SNA had once been powerhouse of early films, producing Charlie Chaplin's comedies and Anderson's own westerns. But by the late 1910s, both the studio and Anderson fortune had faded. Still, Anderson remained active in the business, producing small comedies in Los Angeles and always on the lookout for new talent. It was in this spirit that he backed Stan Laurel for trial picture, with Robbins directing and Hardy brought in for support, leading quite by chance to the very first meeting of Laurel and Hardy on film. The story begins with Stan being thrown out his lodging by his landlady. Out on the street, he stumbles across a stray dog. He doesn't want it, but through a mix-up, the little dog ends up in his bag, and from then on, it refuses to leave his side. Together they drift through small misadventures until Stan runs into Ollie, a blustering crook with a pistol. Ollie tries to rob Stan, but the attempt collapses into a string of clumsy threats, failures, and frantic chases. In the end, the dog saves the day, and the crook is left defeated. Stan Laurel's character is already close to the figure he would later perfect. He comes across as bewildered and slightly helpless, drifting through situations rather than controlling them. Yet at the same time, there are flashes of cunning. He can be sly, finding little tricks to get himself out of the trouble or to turn situation to his advantage. This tension between helplessness and slyness gives him a strange charm. He looks like a fool, but you can never be sure he isn't in on something clever. On the other hand, Oliver Hardy's character is drawn from classic silent film. He dresses with formality, moves with confidence, and carries himself like someone used to being in charge. His large frame and stern face make him obvious figure of authority or menace. Yet he behind plaster, you can already see the comic potential. His dignity too fragile, and once things start to go wrong, his frustration becomes funnier than his threats. After the filming The Lucky Duck, nothing immediately suggested the birth of great comedy team. Laurel went back to his solo career, still trying to shape a screen character, while Hardy continued playing heaviest and supporting parts for different studios. Their meetings as that little two-reeler was a coincidence, a brief crossing of paths in a crowded industry. After The Lucky Duck, a few years later, Laurel and Hardy found himself at Hell Roach Studios, a place that had already nurtured Garrett Lloyd, Charlie Chase, and the Our Gang kids. Roach has built an environment where comedy can flourish, and where talent is given the time and space to work without pressure to rush through the pictures. Hell Roach first noticed Stan Laurel in early 1920s. Stan had been drifting through different studios, acting and directing, when Roach saw promising him and signed him in 1923. By 1925, Laurel was at Roach not regularly, working behind the camera as much as in front of it, learning how to shape comedy with precision. Oliver Hardy came to Roach by another path. A seasoned supporting player, he was already well known around Hollywood as a reliable heavy. He worked in dozens of Charlie Chase shorts. Hardy kept busy at other studios, but 1925 he was returning to Roach with increasing frequency. It was at the Roach lot that Laurel and Hardy paths began to cross more often. Roach himself didn't immediately see them as a team, but he had created the perfect environment for it to happen. Laurel and Hardy first appeared together as a co-star in Ducks Up. They played drums, hiding in a mansion, forced to impersonate the owner and maid when unexpected visitors arrive. Originally, Stan cast Sid Crossley as his partner, but when Crossley didn't appear, Oliver Hardy stepped in. First clear pairing of Laurel and Hardy. Stan, disguised as maid, came across as childish and mischievous, while Hardy carried himself with monk dignity as the mansion's owner. The pacing was slow at first, smooth in tone, before descending into chaotic, Senate-style slapstick. The chemistry is noticed, the performances are gentler than earlier solo work, but not yet developed into a permanent theme. Here, the comedy follows a standard domestic farce. A wife hires a delivery man to make her neglectful husband jealous, while Hardy plays the servant in the household. The misunderstanding escalates into argument and confusion, ending in the noisy, chaotic final. Laurel is excitable and foolish, Hardy self-important and stiff. The script keeps them as enemies rather than partners, losing the gentleness they briefly displayed and tucked up. This short separates them almost entirely. The farce centers on businessman whose former mistress threatens to expose him. Laurel, as his clerk, is sent to manage her, while Hardy appears separately in upper-class skins. The blackmail plot always wore frantic slapstick, and Finlayson trademark double takes, but Laurel and Hardy remain apart without interplay. As a farce, it functions, but it lacks the warmth and rhythm that would define Laurel and Hardy. When later remade as Chickens Come Home, the same premise flourished once they were cast together. Here they began edging closer. Laurel is sailor whose fiancé is kidnapped by a rough sea captain. To rescue her, he disguises himself as a woman, leading to a string of mistaken identity gags. Hardy, as the captain's brutish maid, clashes with Stan repeatedly. For the first time, they share extended sequences, so still mostly as adversaries. The final introduces Anita Kervin, whose biting performance adds style and energy. The comedy moves closer to real Laurel and Hardy piece, even if the story is mediocre. This army comedy introduced a slightly fresher rhythm, with Stan as dim private, Hardy as his overbearing sergeant, and Finlayson as their blustering captain. Much of the movie revolved around training camp routines and Stan repeated blunders, which drive Hardy to fury. The gags are fresher than jealous husband comedies, and the film avoids predictability, but Laurel and Hardy still positioned as soldier versus sergeant, comic opposites rather than partners. After experimenting with army routines, Laurel and Hardy were brought together again in a shipboard comedy. Laurel plays a taxi driver who unwittingly drives a jewel thief, and her midget accomplice disguised as a baby. The story leads on the ship, where Hardy is a ship purser, more interested in flirting with passengers than spotting crime. Once again, the two remains at odds, but Hardy delivers on his earliest camera looks, glancing directly at the audience in mock shyness. This gesture would become one of his defining traits on his character. This short finally brings Laurel and Hardy together in a way that feels familiar. They play cowardly detectives hired to protect a judge from murderer known as Tipton Slasher. The plot has genuine tension, mixing thriller elements with comedy. The long head routines displaced the shared rhythm, moving beyond slapstick to character-driven comedy. They wore disheveled suits and ties that would become the standard outfits. Most importantly, their relationship. Hart is a pompous, self-styled leader. Stan, the childlike, admiring follower. The ending even touched on surreal, almost dreamlike elements, showing that their style was expanding in scope. For the first time, the movie looks and feels like a real Laurel and Hardy comedy. Ironically, after this breakthrough came a step back. The story was weak, Hardy as mighty giant, a boastful caveman, and Laurel as twinkle star, effeminate and timid. The story has little drive. The men compete for the same cave girl, mostly in separate skins. When they do meet, they fight each other. But Hardy's performance showed how fully his comic persona had settled. Dignified yet delicate, pompous yet oddly shy. Stan's character, by contrast, was less consistent, still sliding between extremes. Roach Studio entered into distribution partnership with Pathé in the early 1920s, an arrangement that lasted through the mid-1920s but proved far from ideal, with Pathé also releasing comedies from Max Sennett. Roach's films had to compete directly with those of his rival, often for the same limited theater slots. As a result, many early Laurel and Hardy shorts struggled to make their mark. By late 1927, the strain of competing with Sennett made the collaboration untenable. Roach decided to end his deal with Pathé, determined to find a distributor that could give his studio and his comedy crew the attention they deserved. Looking for stability and growth, Roach turned to Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. Negotiations began in late 1926, and by February 1927, a new distribution deal was signed. It was breakthrough Roach had been waiting for. MGM, the most powerful of major studios, needed short subjects to supply its theater chain. Roach needed theaters with guaranteed bookings. His comedies were now assured of reaching audiences in some of most prestigious movie houses in America. MGM managed distribution and publicity, but Roach kept full control of production. The writers, directors, and actors still worked in their own style, with comedy crafted carefully rather than rushed. The MGM deal gave Roach the security he needed, but the real turning point at the Roach studio came from Leo McCarey, who realized that Laurel and Hardy's true potential lay in making them permanent team. McCarey began at the Roach writing gags for Our Gang and soon directed shorts with Charlie Chase, where he emphasized situation and character. The idea that laughs should come from people we recognize and believe in. It was the same sensibility he later appealed to Laurel and Hardy. While he never took sole credit for directing them, McCary quietly guided for the films, encouraging slower pacing, room for silentness, and space for their personalities to breathe. He helped transform them from two funny men sharing the screen time into a comedy team. A pity that the Sugar Daddies began with MGM, reminiscent of their previous work. This short is another variation on the Sugar Daddy theme, with James Finlayson as wealthy man trapped in an welcome marriage. Laurel plays his lawyer and Hardy his butler, both dragged into increasingly frantic situations. The highlight is Funhouse Chase, posing as an absurdly tall wife. These routines are energetic but not so funny, and Laurel and Hardy remain secondary rather than a true team. But here With the influence of McCary, everything changed. For the first time, Laurel and Hardy were officially teamed, appearing side by side in the same frame almost from the start. Cast as convicts escaping from fantasy prison, they disguise themselves as painters, improvising on their most inspired routines. The pacing allows pauses between gags, letting the contrasting characters breathe. By the final, dressed in tuxedos and mistaken for French dignitaries, they were pretending to be high society. Here, the balance of slapstick and personality finally showed what made Laurel and Hardy unique. So, Heads Off has been lost for decades. Hale Roach considered it one of Laurel and Hardy's strongest early efforts and used it to showcase the newly formed team. Their short featured the boys as door-to-door washing machine salesmen, struggling to deliver a machine up an impossibly long staircase for a disinterested customer is similar to later masterpieces like Music Walk.
Well, when are you two numbskulls going to take this thing out of the way?
In contrast, putting pens on Philip emphasizes character dynamics and timing over chaotic spectacle. Hardy plays the straight-laced uncle, while Stan is hyperactive, ill-clad girl chaser. The comedy relies on long visual gags, carefully timed pauses, and culturally embarrassing situations, creating a sense of realism absent from many of the previous fantasy-like plots. It includes some of the earliest fully developed Laurel and Hardy gags, blending subtlety with physical comedy. The Battle of the Century experimented with Keystone-style slapstick, but with a new sense of structured comedic spectacle. Stan is a terrified prizefighter, Hardy is concerned manager, and a simple boxing match escalates into famous pie fight. Unlike earlier, purely chaotic fight sequences, the short links each gag to timing and character reaction, making the comedy feel more grounded. Staged pie throwing balances realism with anarchy, demonstrating the dual creative mastery of physical humor. Sam suffers from toothache, and Ollie escorts him to the dentist. The ensuing house, do-it-yourself extractions, terrified screams, and laughing gas bullet mayhem allow the duo's physical comedy to flourish. Edgar Kennedy made his first Laurel and Hardy appearance as a traffic cop, establishing the archetype of the gruff but endearing foil, contrasting with Jimmy Fenlison's expressive anger. Leave Him Laughing was an early overseas success, demonstrating the universal appeal of Laurel and Hardy's humor. Laurel and Hardy play finishers, bumbling carpenters tasked with finishing a client's house. They attempt by demanding neighbors, a strict nurse, and officious cop, heightening the tension and comedy. The premise foreshadows the inevitable collapse of the house, but the humor lies in the inventive escalation of obstacles and physical comedy rather than predictable outcome. The short emphasizes the duo ability to generate chaos. As waiters in high society dinner, Laurel and Hardy navigate slow-paced sequences that allow expression and visual gags to shine. Stan spills up and misinterprets instructions while Ollie repeatedly falls into deserts. Anita Garvin's fruit cocktail sequence recalls us similars in the second 100 years, but with decreased tempo and no rushing. This short demonstrates the duo's refined timing and the balance of physical comedy. Laurel and Hardy play two hopeless musicians who ruin an orchestra performance and promptly fire. Losing their jobs, they attempt to entertain passerby, but frustration quickly escalates into full-scale physical brawl, culminating in physical comedy that focuses on them punching each other, adding fresh twists to their slapstick repertoire. The short shows Laurel and Hardy essence. The world is never there to control, and they quarrel but cannot live apart. Bound by failures, dignity is endlessly assaulted, and along with fragile hope for a better day. The duo portrays hand-picked husbands navigating domestic mishaps and social entanglements, returning to the old family comedy formula. They attend a party with fake money in their wallets, attempting to impress young women while avoiding the wrath of their wives. The short reintroduces classic slapstick within a structured domestic setting. Ollie enjoys a rare moment domestic calm until Stan arrives, dressed in golf tux and disrupts the household. Ollie accompanies Stan to the golf course where they form a foursome with two young beauties. The pair fumbles through the golf routines, unpleasant encounters with burly golfer, and final mud fight. The short recycles the familiar pie fight formulas, emphasizes the Laurel and Hardy's mastery of long-take physical comedy and timing. Ollie inherits a fortune and moves into mansion, appointing Stan as his butler. The short is built mostly around two-man routines, with Hardy drunk and refusing to sleep, and Stan in anger that he cannot calm him down. The gags are average, the material feels poor. They slip back into their passé period, playing more adversaries than true partners. The duo, now sailors, on short leave, rent a car, pick up two girls, and unwittingly get stuck in massive traffic jam. The short uses reciprocal distraction routine. The action is deliberately slowed, letting gags simmer and highlighting Laurel and Hardy's timing. This short makes a refinement of the rapid-fire formula and demonstrates how the team could adapt old routines into a more deliberate, character-driven style. A mad scientist hires Laurel and Hardy to retrieve a corpse from graveyard for his experiment. Stan and Ollie reluctantly enter cemetery, but their efforts are thwarted by their own terror and deceptive detective posing as corpse, building on their previous spooky graveyard routines from Detective Sing. The sequence with the slow timing and pacing elevates the horror comedy theme. The short demonstrates the team's ability to create suspense and emphasize with dark humor alongside slapstick. Laurel and Hardy attempt to escape their wives for poker game, inviting a ruse involving an appointment at the off-ramp theater. En route to the game, they help two damsels in distress and fall into a muddy gutter. As their clothes are drying in the girl's bed, the boys get boisterously drunk. Their humor stays close to realism, with the wives catching them in the act and supposed trip to the Orpheum proving fictitious. Extended camera sequences allow full character development, highlighting both Stan's helplessness and Ollie's desperation. The short reinforces the team's blend of domestic comedy and slapstick. In Liberty, Laurel and Hardy, two escaped convicts, mistakenly swap pens and struggle to switch them back through a series of increasingly absurd locations, culminating atop a partially constructed skyscraper. Unlike Carl Lloyd, whose skyscraper comedies relied on thrill and suspense, Laurel and Hardy turned the situation into a study of character, generating tension comedy where the slapstick and danger emerge from partner rather than from the fear of heights. Laurel and Hardy work and stable and misinterpret a situation involving the famous stolen painting Blue Boy. Thinking the horse is a missing object, they deliver it to millionaire house, struggling to follow his ridiculous instructions. The humor comes from escalating misunderstanding, the character's naivety and slapstick routines. The short blends traditional physical gags with subtle reactions to the duo personas. Ollie's inheritance depends on him being happily married, but Mrs. Hardy has walked out, leaving Stan to impersonate her when Ollie's uncle visits. Stan's performance as the wife draws attention and set up nightclub sequence, culminating in the theft of necklace that exposes the ruse and cost Ollie his fortune. Classic slapstick routines drive the comedy with mistaken identities, physical gags, and escalating chaos. In what is often hailed as one of Laurel and Hardy's greatest silent comedies, the boys are Christmas tree salesmen, going door to door with their stock. They encounter particularly irritable homeowner, played by James Finlayson. A minor disagreement quickly escalates into all-out war. Stan and Ollie dismantle Finn's house and furnishing piece by piece, while he retaliates by wrecking their car. By the end, both home and automobile are reduced to rubble, and policeman arrives just in time to witness the devastation. Big business epitomizes the team's reciprocal destruction formula, but with unmatched intensity and rhythm. The short is sustained in grace of comic escalation, its tempo rising bit by bit until everything collapses in total anarchy. Maybe most anarchistic of all their sorts, a perfect balance of slapstick violence, character stubbornness, and the inevitability of disaster. Stan and Ollie are the new doorman at Swanky Hotel, continuing their service in the house, as previously in the nuts at the soup. Their ineptitude quickly entangles them with a haughty blonde, a cab driver, and a pseudo-Russian prince. The short features many improvisational gags and playful fights between the two, oriented more towards slapstick rather than story. Laurel and Hardy are attachment officers tasked with repositioning a delinquent customer radio. The routine escalates into a house with the radio smashed by steamroller and the boys' own car flattened. The story takes backseat to slapstick, emphasizing improvisation and the team's skill at generating humor from mundane situations. A runaway affection-starved goat attaches itself to Laurel and Hardy, following them home and causing havoc in their boarding house. Attempts to bust the goat result in a water fight, soaking the boys, the landlord, and neighbor. So not the strongest silent effort. The short reuses familiar gags and routines that would later appear in Laughing Gravy and the Chimp. It marks the team's last silent short, a project Stan preferred over the comic talkies to the creative, is it allowed?